Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, dwyersportsbetting.com. Today is August the 1st, 2017. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. First, Bitcoin Cash. Folks, it's happening right now. The Bitcoin chain forked just a few hours ago. My prediction is that Bitcoin Cash is going to be a huge success, right? Over time, I believe it's going to cannibalize Bitcoin. In fact, it's going to force Bitcoin to be more innovative, to answer the challenge. Why? Because sooner or later, markets win out. Once you, the consumer, figures out that Bitcoin Cash is more robust, can handle more transactions, can do so more cheaply than Bitcoin, you're not only going to flock to Bitcoin Cash, but Bitcoin is going to catch up technologically, right? They're going to have to work at it. You're not going to have a group able to say, let's keep the 1 megabyte block size. That's not going to cut it in a world where there's competition, right? Just keep an eye on Bitcoin Cash. I'm not telling anybody how to invest. You keep an eye on it, look at the price levels over time, and you make the decision for yourself. As I like to say, the best decisions make themselves. Now let's talk about, real briefly, my own editorial here, why I have always been more of a baseball guy than a football guy. You know, with baseball, you get the feeling that these baseball players have personal lives, that they understand that as good of a gig that they have being a major leaguer, right? They understand that it's their profession, it's a job, they're a professional, right? They don't own part of the team. They don't have equity in the team, right? There are limits on what their employer can ask of them. Limits. If I were to tell a baseball player, hey, go out there and die for me, that baseball player is going to look at me like any employee who understands an employment relationship. And they're going to say, you got to be kidding me. You're expecting me to give my life for this job? No matter how well compensated they are. Right now, that's not the case in football. I've never figured out the ethos. Never. Right? People in football act as if they're in the military. As if what they're doing is some higher calling. As if they're out there defending their family, defending their country, right? To all of these NFL types, you're not in the military. You're not a soldier who is laying his life on the line for the country. No, you're putting your health at risk for your employer. Jerry Jones, Robert Kraft, the Mara family. Right? That's what you're doing. So it's really disheartening to me when I see a young football player, right, in a room with Roger Goodell, talk about how if he dies on the field, well, the field would be a great place to die. Now, for those of you with desk jobs, how many of you would even think that dying at your desk is the way to go? If you have that thought, then quite frankly, in my opinion, you don't have enough of a life, right? Football players, at the end of the day, quite frankly, need to look out for themselves, right? It's an employment relationship. All of these great players from the 1980s, guess what? They don't own equity in the teams they played for. Understand too, when it's a business transaction, when it's an employment relationship where money is involved, right? The employer has you working on the field so they can make money, folks. It's all for profit. Right? Just to understand that over time, these teams, many of them are going to be sold. The goodwill that you've engendered with the current ownership group might not extend to the next ownership group. Teams dissolve. I know we have a Cleveland Browns team out there. Guess what? That's not even the same team that Jim Brown played for, even though it's called Cleveland Browns. Right? Jim Brown's team moved out of town. They're now the Baltimore Ravens. Right? Think it through. The great Baltimore Colts back in the day, John Mackey, Johnny Unitas, understand they moved to Indianapolis. Guys like John Mackey before his dementia took over. Right? Players need to be cognizant of the health risks involved. John Mackey refused to even be honored by the Indianapolis Colts because, as Mackey put it, that's not where I played. Right? So, NFL players who are confused, who feel that they have to go out there and risk their lives, right? That they need to play through concussions, that they need to lie to trainers about torn tendons, broken bones, so they can play in the big game. You're kidding yourself. You're mistreating yourself. I'm a little bit older. You see the gray here, right? I'm just telling you, you get up to your 40s and your 50s, and you're going to look back and you're going to ask yourself, what the hell was I doing in my 20s? I know older people watching this video realize that some of the jobs they've had in their lives, these days, those jobs just represent whatever money is left in their bank account from the job, right? That's how you remember the job. You know, oh yeah, I was a carpenter in my 20s, you know, what did that get me? Some equity in my house, some money in the bank, right? There are many older people now who are thinking to themselves, what was I doing even in that job? I wouldn't do that job today. Now just imagine if you were silly enough in your 20s to reach the conclusion that this is the best I can do in life. I'm prepared to die on the job. A job that's set up simply to make profits for the owners, right? Understand, it's all a means to an end. The entertainment that it provides all of us has an end goal. It's to make money for the owners. They wouldn't be in the game if it didn't make a profit. So forgive me, but look, I'm not going to die at my desk. That's not my goal in life. If I were a professional athlete, I certainly wouldn't be talking about dying on the field, right? I'd give my life for my country. I'd give my life for my family. I'm not going to give my life for my employer. I know I have a lot of boxing fans out there. I understand boxing is very violent. We're talking about a sport where people are trying to give opponents concussions. They're trying to get what we call knockouts. Right? If you knock the other guy down and he's unconscious for 10 seconds, hey, that's a good day for you. Right? I get it. This is a sport where some retired fighters have shakes, Parkinson's, slurred speech. Right? There are enough of them where I'm sure even casual boxing fans understand that that's one of the risks of the sport, right? And I know fans talk in terms of courage. Can this guy suck it up? Is this guy willing to do what it takes to win this fight? Right? All I can say with all of that is the boxers need to think about themselves first, right? You have young fighters out there who have eye problems, and they're debating whether to continue on in the sport. You've got to be kidding me. I'm from the Beirut Shumanov camp. That was a guy who was champion. He developed eye problems. You know what he thought about? He thought about his young son. He thought about his quality of life when he was not working in his profession, working at his job. He walked away from the sport. I love boxing, but it's not worth losing an eye over, right? If some boxer says, I'm prepared to die in this fight, I'm going to write down in my private notes, analyzing the boxer, this young man is confused. He doesn't get it. Let's understand this is all a for-profit enterprise. Let's understand this is for our entertainment. Value your life more than having it be something you're willing to give up to entertain others. All right, let's talk about boxing. Let's talk about some of these fights that are being discussed. Two in particular. Now, many of you are saying that Jarrell Miller, the heavyweight, who's a great talker, should fight Dillian Whyte, the heavyweight, who's a great talker. Right now, the fight's intriguing. Don't get me wrong. It'd be a great fight. Dillian Whyte beat Derek Chisora, who's very front foot heavy, who bores in a lot like Jarrell Miller. Now, let's be real here. Jarrell Miller's a bit of an original, right? Because the guy weighed more than 290 pounds, just a shade under 300 pounds his last fight. Let's just say when he's barreling in on you, it's a little bit different than Derek Chisora barreling in on you. There's about 50 to 60 pounds of weight difference between the two guys, right? I know the critics of Chisora are going to say, it's less than that, right? It's 30 to 35 pounds. Okay, fair enough, right? And Derek, let's face it too, Dillian Whyte, in my opinion, from this seat at least, is the more skilled fighter than Jarrell Miller, right? Miller is really more physical. Whyte is more skilled. Now, I agree. It would be a great fight. It'd be a great fight. But if you were the manager for either, right? If you were the manager really for either of these guys in this splintered heavyweight division where every other fighter has a belt, right? Joseph Parker has a belt. Deontay Wilder has a belt. Anthony Joshua has a belt. Folks, that's already too many belts, isn't it? You know, wasn't Fresno Kendo going to fight Shannon Briggs for a title? My point to you is the champions need the contenders as much as the contenders need the champions. Right? These champions need legitimacy with you, the boxing fan. There's a reason why. Deontay Wilder, who's unbeaten, who has a greater than 90% KO ratio, right? Who's been knocking out guys in his heavyweight defenses. Arthur Spielka hits the canvas, right? Eric Molina hits the canvas. The last guy he fought, Gerald Washington, hits the canvas, right? There's a reason why. Chris Arreola, doesn't go the distance. But yet, Deontay Wilder was there trying to get Luis Ortiz to fight him. And the reason is these champions know that to be champion carries a responsibility. They need to fight credible opponents. If you aren't out there finding and fighting credible opponents, sooner or later, you're going to be viewed as a paper champion. That's one of the biggest insults you could levy against a fighter in boxing, right? All of these guys want authenticity. So, in my opinion, in the entire heavyweight division, two of the best situated guys for a heavyweight title shot would be Dillian Whyte, right? Let's face it, the United Kingdom is a hotbed for boxing right now. His fight against Derek Chisora was a big domestic dust-up. Anthony Joshua is an Englishman, right? I know the British press has to be showing up saying, hey, are you going to give Whyte a rematch? Right? You can imagine if any of these other fighters, Hughie Fury, he's an Englishman, right? You can imagine if he beats Joseph Parker, people are going to start asking him about Dillian Whyte. People are already asking Joseph Parker about Dillian Whyte, right? So if you're already in a great position to have one of these champs fight you, and keep in mind, you don't have to be the mandatory contender. What you really need to be is a box office draw. If you're where the money is in this professional for-profit fight game, and you're credible, right? You've beaten people like Derek Chisora. Some heavyweight champion is going to find you. Some heavyweight champion is going to want to fight you. Right? Jarrell Miller, I'm telling you, one of the best stories in the sport is this sparring session between him and Deontay Wilder. Right? He's one of the people who should be on Wilder's short list. Now, I give Wilder credit. Wilder's trying to hunt down Luis Ortiz, who's a big threat to the title. Right? If he doesn't get Luis Ortiz, I'm just saying, you know, promoters are looking for storylines to promote. That, did Miller get a concussion sparring with Deontay Wilder, or did he go to the hospital afterwards? Because of dehydration storyline is one that would be all over the news. You can imagine if those two guys announced that they were going to fight each other, and if they did a 24/7, they would be talking to everyone who was in the gym that day. Right? The, seconds in Wilder's corner. The seconds with Miller. Right? The guy who drove Miller to the hospital. You'd be hearing about all of this. You'd be interested in that fight, especially since both guys are unbeaten. Right? So, in my eyes, when you have a great fight that you know is going to deplete the fighters, right? Dillian Whyte against Jarrell Miller. Folks, nobody gets out of that fight without getting hit hard a few times. Right? Have that fight when one of the guys is wearing a belt. Right? Make that a title fight. Don't make that a fight before either guy has a belt. Right? Let's talk about another fight that I'm hearing about. This fight's totally preposterous to me. Danny Jacobs. Now keep in mind, there are many of you, trust me, I've read many comments here online, who believe Danny Jacobs beat Golovkin. Right? Now somehow, there's discussion about Danny Jacobs fighting Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. Now, show you how having box office appeal gives a fighter. Right? Chavez Jr., believe it or not, got more than 1 million pay-per-view buys in his last fight against Canelo. That was box office gold, folks. Right? That's the only reason why he's viable. Because from this seat, it looks to me like Chavez Jr. is, dare I say it publicly, a shot fighter. Right? You were looking at the Canelo fight. Folks, that fight's over by like the third round. By the third round, you understood that Chavez Jr. just didn't have the reflexes, just didn't have the game to beat Canelo. Hell, he was supposed to be the bigger man. He couldn't even stay in the pocket against Canelo. You got to the later rounds. Let me say this. We just saw Adrian Broner against Mikey Garcia. At least in the later rounds, Adrian Broner tried to get a KO. Stepped on the gas a little bit. In the Canelo fight, Chavez Jr. was so shot, in my opinion, he couldn't even do that. Now let's define what's meant by shot. I believe the average man on the street understands that his reflexes at 20 are probably better than his reflexes at 40. Right? If he's a regular guy who, isn't a professional athlete, and he's not, keeping himself in Bernard Hopkins type shape between his 20th birthday and his 40th birthday, right? If he's not counting the calories in every meal, if he's not, in the gym, sparring diligently, making sure he's always in shape. Now, I know many of you right now are thinking, hey, isn't Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. a professional athlete? Maybe, but he hasn't lived the lifestyle I'm talking about. Right? I'm talking about the Bernard Hopkins lifestyle. I'm talking about the Golovkin lifestyle. I'm talking about a professional prize fighter who takes his craft seriously. Right? Floyd Mayweather in his prime. Guys who don't drink. Now that's the opposite of guys like Chavez Jr., who according to reports got busted for DUI during a training camp. Right? Guys who know when they show up to the weigh-in that they're going to make weight. In fact, the personality type I'm talking about will often show up to a weigh-in and actually weigh less than the weight limit. Right? You know who these guys are. Vladimir Klitschko, two brothers. I've never seen either guy out of shape. Never. Right? Evander Holyfield, never saw him out of shape. Never. Now, I can't say the same about Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. Understand, this guy is so hit or miss that he had a fight once against Brian Vera where his own promoter, days before the fight, not months before the fight, no, days before the fight. This is after contracts had been signed. This is after the guys were in training camp. They couldn't tell you what weight the fight was being fought at. Because behind the scenes, they knew that Chavez Jr. couldn't make the weight. And they didn't want to give you some alternative weight that he couldn't make either. So, Chavez Jr. didn't keep himself in shape during his prime. Folks, his prime's behind him like this wall's behind me. Right? He didn't keep himself in shape in his prime. His reflexes have dimmed. What a shot fighter is a guy who, even if he knows what to do, can no longer do it. Right? Ali admitted before his death, right, in interviews where he was talking about his life and his career, that he reached a point where he knew what punches were coming at him, but he couldn't do anything about it. Right? You get older, things happen. Right? Your hair's not as thick as it once was on top. Right? The whiskers start to turn gray. You don't bounce back the next morning after a night at the pub. Right? Chavez Jr., whatever his chronological age, he's older than most. It's so bad that Danny Jacobs, a middleweight, has said, as this fight's being discussed, nothing's been signed, that he's willing it's so ridiculous. Jacobs is saying he's willing to fight Chavez Jr. at whatever weight he chooses. Right? 168 pounds, 175 pounds. Folks, what that tells you is Chavez Jr. at this stage of his career doesn't even have an identifiable weight class. Right? Danny Jacobs wouldn't be busting out with lines like that if he were talking about fighting James DeGale. You would know the fight's at 168. Right? He wouldn't be saying that if he were talking about Gilberto Ramirez. You would know the fight's at 168 if Danny Jacobs is going to the guy's division. Right? He has to say that with Chavez Jr., doesn't he? Chavez Jr.'s last fight against Canelo, by the way, again, Canelo, just like Danny Jacobs, Understand, Canelo has fought at middleweight. You know something's wrong when so many guys who are smaller than you want to fight you. Right? Canelo said, okay, I'll fight you at 164 and a half pounds. We don't want to see, as the boxing public, we don't want to see Chavez Jr. again at 164 and a half because that didn't work in the Canelo fight. Only one guy looked ready to fight. You know what I mean? So, let me just say, Danny Jacobs against Chavez Jr., whatever weight they fight at. Whatever weight they fight at. Take Danny Jacobs. I mean, Danny Jacobs just gave Golovkin his most competitive match. Right? Danny Jacobs just gave one of the best in boxing his most competitive match. How is Chavez Jr. even going to make the fight competitive? Right? So that fight's a joke. Let me say this too. People need to realize Danny Jacobs is a puncher. I know you just saw him go the distance against Canelo, but Jacobs really is a puncher. Now, Canelo has set a benchmark against Chavez Jr., right, of destroying him over 12 rounds. I'm guessing Danny Jacobs would want to beat that benchmark. I'm guessing Danny Jacobs would want a stoppage. Right? Not the kind Andres Fonfara got over Chavez Jr., where Chavez Jr. sitting in the corner and quits on the stool. But I'm guessing Danny Jacobs wants better than that. He'll want to make a statement. Let me also say this too. And real old-timers know this. I'm talking about guys in their 70s and 80s. If you're the smaller fighter and you're fighting a guy in a heavier weight class, you don't have to gain all the weight to fight the guy at that weight class. So if Danny Jacobs decides, hey, I'll fight him at 175, that doesn't mean that Danny Jacobs has to weigh 175. Right? By the way, that also doesn't mean that Danny Jacobs needs some catch weight in the contract. Fight him at a traditional weight. If Danny Jacobs wants, he can come in. Jacobs is big for 160. If Danny Jacobs wants, he can come in 168. Right? He doesn't have to weigh 175. If he doesn't want his body ballooning so that he has to deal with what Roy Jones dealt with after fighting for the heavyweight title, where he loses the weight and then he's dead in the water. Right? If he doesn't want to yo-yo his weight, put on muscle that he knows he has to lose if he's going to compete back at 160, if he wants to go back down, or at 168. Right? If he doesn't want that challenge, if he doesn't want to be Kell Brook in the second half of his fight against Errol Spence, after Brook had fought at 160 against Golovkin, right, and drops 2 weight classes to get down to 147, right, 13 pounds, which is big in boxing for a fight at 147, then maybe what Danny Jacobs needs to do is to just say, hey, look, whatever weight you want to show up, go ahead. We'll cap it at 175, right? Then Jacobs should just go about his business. If he comes in 164, if he comes in 168, great. That still doesn't mean that Chavez Jr. is going to be able to get by Jacobs' jab. Right? That still doesn't mean that Chavez Jr. is going to be able to deal with Jacobs' punching power. The punching power that stopped Kid Chocolate in 1 round. So let me just say, as soon as that Danny Jacobs Chavez Jr. fight is announced, you don't have to wait for the small print. This is that rare opportunity where you don't have to ask yourself the normal questions, right? What weight class are they fighting at? No, forget it. As soon as they announce Danny Jacobs against Chavez Jr. You need to get out of your seat. You need to go to the window. You need to say, hey, I'm putting money on Danny Jacobs. And then you need to ask the obvious question. By the way, what are the odds? Anyway, that's how I see it. Let me hear from you. I hope you leave your comments in the comment section to this video about anything I've discussed. Right? Some young guy in the NFL talking about being willing to die on the field. Dylan Whyte, Jarrell Miller. My belief is they should wait for title shots. If you want to stay busy, you can do so the Customato way, right? In the gym, inviting other contenders over and having hardcore sparring sessions, right? Think about it. Vladimir Klitschko somehow sparred with Deontay Wilder, Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury, right? Think about it, right? Your stay busy doesn't have to necessarily be in the ring if you're a veteran and don't need to test yourself before a crowd, right? I think Jarrell Miller and Dylan Whyte should wait for a championship opportunity. I think the champions need them as much as they need the champions, right? And my own personal belief is Danny Jacobs against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. is an absolute mismatch. The only reason that fight's even being discussed is because Chavez Jr. still has proven box office appeal. That's how I see it. Let me hear your thoughts. I hope you leave them in the comment section to this video. Thanks for stopping by.